Here we are again. This time we're looking at a 2022 Marin Alpine Trail E1. So this is an electric assist mountain bike. So there might be some controversy out there, people with attitudes for or against e-mountain bikes. I say to each their own. And really what changes some people's minds is to think about this as having a chairlift in your pocket. There isn't too much negative being said about people shuttling up to descending trails or taking a chairlift at a bike park. I would say that this bike, as much as any in the mountain bike world, is really a bike that is your own personal shuttle in your pocket, chairlift in your pocket, whatever you want to call it. So, with that in mind, we are going to look at the details of this bike, some of the specifications, maybe who it is best going to suit, and yeah, a little bit of geometry stuff in there as well. So let's get to it. So our shop, Bike Bros, is in Cochrane, Alberta, Canada. So the prices that you see here, $62.99. That is a Canadian price, and this is as of late July 2021. I'm learning to have to say that because during the pandemic we have seen prices increasing at a pretty rapid pace with a number of things between the cost of freight, cost of parts, cost of boxes, shortages of things, all of these affecting prices. But $62.99 is the price of this Alpine Trail E1. This is the base of a 2-lineup Alpine Trail e-bike program. The top of the line Alpine Trail E2 is $81.99 in Canada. And the big thing that you're getting with that is a component upgrade, and then we're also stepping up from the Shimano E7000, which we have on this bike, up to the EP8, which is the cutting edge, top of the line Shimano drivetrain. So we have, with price increases on e-bikes, you're seeing what we're used to on mountain bikes, which is components changing, but then also your electric drive unit changing along with that. So the general info on this bike, it's a 54.4 pound bike, $62.99 Canadian price. It is 150 millimeters of travel in the rear and 160 millimeter travel fork. Geometry wise, this is very much oriented towards being confidence inspiring, downhill, high speed kind of a bike. So in this case here, your electric motor really is to help you get up the climbs, and then the rest of the bike is all about really getting down the descents on a bike that feels a lot like a regular bike. And that's one of the things I'm going to be touching on with this bike, is it really is trying to mimic the feel of a natural unassisted bike with its geometry, and even a little bit in how the Shimano motor affects or doesn't affect the drive on this guy. So 150, 160 travel. The suspension is all done through Marin's multi-track suspension. So what that means is we're looking at a linkage driven single pivot design, with that pivot being right behind that upper portion of the chain guide there. There we see it on this side. That pivot position is changed a little bit from where it would be on a non-E version of an Alpine Trail. And without having charts to look at, my assumption is that they're trying to keep the anti-squat on this bike to match up with it having that much more power because of the electric motor. So they don't want you to basically just pedal yourself out of your suspension, because you potentially have 3 times the amount of power going into the drivetrain as you would on a non-assisted version. For those who aren't familiar with e-bike talk, when we're talking about a pedal assist e-bike, we're talking about a bike that is only going to amplify the power that you're putting into the system. There is no throttle on this bike, and the speed is governed to 20 miles an hour or 32 kilometers an hour. Back to the drivetrain stuff, we have a Dior 10-speed drivetrain, so that's got a clutch on there to give us all that stuff we love about a clutched 1x drivetrain. On the front we have a narrow wide chainring. Marin did put an extra wide, I believe it's a 34 or 35 millimeter internal width rim on this bike, and that goes hand in hand with the fact that we're actually looking at a 27.5 by 2.8 rear tire. So in the acoustic version of an Alpine Trail, they have 29-inch wheels front and rear. On the e-bike version, they have gone with a 27.5 by 2.8 rear with a 29-inch front. So that is, if you want to be trendy, you can talk about it being a mullet bike. In this case here, I think there's some practical applications for it. That 2.8-inch wide Minion DHR that's on here is going to help to manage the fact that you're able to put that much more power into the ground. And you also have that much more weight behind the bike, so it's going to make that rear wheel a little bit more robust, I would say. Both the fact that it's a smaller diameter and wider rim width. They've gone as far as even putting an EXO Plus. I hope you can see that with the way this thing goes in and out of focus. But it's an EXO Plus tire, so a little bit of extra protection over just being an EXO tire. One of the things that we've already heard the comments from staff and the few people who have seen this is that it really keeps an aesthetic of a mountain bike. It doesn't have kind of an unusual e-bike shape to it. The bulbosity of the down tube isn't so crazy. That's where the battery is kept underneath. And so it's not this huge chamber holding a massive battery. They've kept things pretty small. The Shimano motor that they have in there is pretty small as well. One thing to note on here is that they put 165 millimeter long cranks on this guy. So typical these days, up until just a couple of years ago, 175 millimeter cranks would be quite normal on all mountain bikes. Now we're starting to see 170s on a lot of enduro focused bikes, and then on this e-bike they've gone down to 165. And I think that's a little bit to do with the fact that you could potentially be pedaling this through chunkier stuff because you've got such a supple bike and that assistance of an electric drive, that they want to make sure that you aren't catching pedals on the ground as easily or as often as if that was a 170 or a 175 crank on there. We have a RockShox Super Deluxe rear shock. So they have gone with a coil sprung rear shock on here. And that I think is a pretty wise decision, going hand in hand with the electric system. What you'll tend to find with the coil rear shock is that it's just that little bit more supple in the beginning of the stroke. And so that's really going to help that rear tire to sort of hug the ground, help to make up for the fact that you've got that much more power into that rear tire. So if you're climbing up looser terrain, you're going to hold traction a little bit longer, and it's really going to help the bike to feel really planted to the ground. We have a Transex dropper post on here. We have a Marin e-bike specific saddle. What you'll tend to see is any bikes that are called e-bike saddles will tend to have just a little bit more of a scoop at the very back of the saddle. I'm not sure what the ergonomics thought on that is. The only thing I find is that I actually really like the shape of e-bike saddles and have put one on an acoustic bike of my own at one point and quite liked it. So up to the front end of this bike, we're looking at a RockShox Gold 35 RL. So the Gold is a 35 millimeter stanchion fork. It's 160 millimeters of travel. It's got a sticker that says e-emtb on there, so that means it's appropriate for this bike. It's basically going to give you a pretty sturdy fork, not fancy. You don't have tons of controls, but you do have, it is an air fork, as we can see over there. That's your air cap. You've got some compression adjustment up here, and then you still have your rebound control and a through axle, which I would say are all appropriate for the non-fiddly mountain biker. So to go with that rear Minion DHR, we have a Minion, or a Maxxis Assegai front tire, also in that Exo Plus casing. So this is going to give us one of the most trusted front tires out there for good traction. With that Exo Plus casing, and it's tubeless compatible, all ready to go, but not set up tubeless yet. So a really good tire match for something that's going to be capable of quite a bit of speed. Up at the handlebars, we have a Marin 780mm wide handlebar, 35mm long Marin stem. The Marin bars have a pretty nice rise and sweep to them. They're a pretty natural feeling bar. We have the 400 series of Shimano calipers and levers, which means that it's the first price point that we actually get into a 4-piston Shimano brake. So you don't have servo wave in these levers, which is why they put a longer lever on there. But if you ride the brakes in far enough, you can still get one finger braking. And I've actually seen a couple pretty positive reviews on these brakes now, talking about them, yeah, quite favorably. So a decent brake, and it helps to keep the price at that oh so reasonable $62.99. We have Marin's lock-on grips on here, a reasonable stock grip, I would say. We have little bump stops on the down tube. So because we have that extra bulbosity of the down tube on here, to keep the rest of the geometry of the bike to be quite normal and to not stack the front end up too tall, they're putting these bump stops on here so that the crown of your fork doesn't interfere or cause damage to your down tube. One thing to note on these guys is that removal of the battery isn't like a super quick fix kind of a thing. You are having to use some fasteners to get the battery out of there. When you're doing a recharge, they're thinking more about you using the little plug port here to do your recharging. I'll show you just a few close-ups of things here. We have some nice big 203 rotors, front and rear. The nice kind of details on all of the pivot stuff, which this is just standard fare on the Marins now. That telltale shape that you're looking at an Alpine Trail with that slight bend to the top tube. The oh so subtle top tube graphic there. Their little E logo. Your power button, which is nicely incorporated into your top tube. You still have a couple water bottle mounts on here, though I suspect that you're going to be limited to a small bottle with the way this is on here. So our limiting factors are the fact that we've got a piggyback shock, limits how far back they can put that water bottle mount and still keep a really nice low top tube height. So those are some of the specifications and some close-ups. Now I'll kind of keep filming stuff as I just talk about geometry on here. So as I mentioned before, one of the great things about this bike is that it really mimics the geometry of a non-e-bike version of the Alpine Trail. So this is actually, I've now recommended this bike, and 3 friends have deposits down on these bikes because they're just going to be using an e-bike on those days when they in the past would have been shuttling, Now they're going to be using e-bikes so that they can self-shuttle, and with two people they can actually go up and down together and not just one vehicle up and down and one lonely rider. So because they're going back and forth from their standard mountain bike, my suggestion was make sure you get a bike, especially in rear end length, that's going to be really similar to what you ride on a daily basis. What I would say is some of the bikes that have an exceptionally long rear end compared to a non-powered bike, that could really bite you in the butt if you hopped on this and within the first couple hundred meters of a ride you have a bit of a drop and you're having to do just a last minute yank on your front wheel to kind of land two wheels evenly. If that rear end of the bike is really long, your timing is going to be off and you're going to nosedive off that drop. So to keep things simple, if you're doing a two bike quiver of a standard enduro-ish kind of a bike and then also a powered one, my suggestion is really pay attention to getting an e-bike with a shorter rear end. There are some arguments of the long rear ends, which is to help make the bikes more stable and maybe climb steeper stuff without wanting to wheelie. I think that's a great argument, but only for people who an e-bike is going to become their only bike. To go along with the climbing side of things, Marin has a really steep seat tube angle on these bikes. So that's a 78-degree seat tube angle with quite a long straight section there. So they're giving you room that you can have a really long dropper post on there. So on the descents, you can make this feel very much like a downhill bike with your seat out of the way, and then get your seat up to a good pedaling height on the way up. So 78 degrees on seat tube angle. Rear end on this bike is 435 millimeters, so that is shorter than some other even less aggressive acoustic bikes out there, and only 5 millimeters longer than the non-e-bike version of the Alpine Trail. Head tube angle on this is 73 degrees or 63 degrees. That compares to 63.5 on the acoustic version of the Alpine Trail, so very, very close. The reach measurement, so that horizontal distance ahead of your cranks, if you went straight up from your cranks and then a line straight forward to the center of your head tube at the top there, that's your reach. This is 485 millimeters in a size large. I'm 6'1", so I always look at size larges as my kind of basis on a bike's geometry. But 485 millimeters compared to it being 480 mils on the acoustic version. So very, very close, and they're going a little bit longer because they know that this thing's going to be doing more high-speed riding, and they're trying to make it that little bit more stable and planted with a little bit longer wheelbase. I'll just show you a little bit more about these controls that are up here. This is the subtle stuff. This is how Shimano is doing their e-bike stuff. This of course is just an acoustic shifter. There is your buttons there that would take you up or down in assistance. And there's your little readout that you get. One of the cool things on this bike is if you get to test ride one, try it with no assist. What you'll find is that the Shimano drive system gets about as close to not feeling any kind of drag through the motor. So if you are riding a descent in a fully acoustic mode on this, you've just used the electric power to get up, and then you're going to ride the downhill in manual mode, you're not going to feel like there's this little bit of drag always trying to slow you down. It's really low resistance. So, I hope that answers any questions you might have in your head about e-bikes. Some other general thoughts if you're looking at e-bikes. There's a lot of garbage out there that comes straight from China, and some company has just thrown a logo on it. I'm not that particular, whether it's Shimano or Bosch or Yamaha or a Specialized system. I think what you're finding on all of the bigger bike shop brands is a couple things. You're going to get really, well, a much better chance of getting follow-up service, especially something like Shimano. Like that's going to be about as universal as it gets. So you go road tripping and you're 1,000 kilometers from home and something happens. The Shimano diagnostics is done through the same system that they would use on Shimano's electronic shifting. So if a shop is going to be able to look after you with virtually any kind of issues, the Shimano system may be the most universal of the bunch as far as diagnostics and being able to track down parts quickly. The other part of it is, if you think about like a technical climb, you're going to really need this motor to kick in a really intuitive and reliable kind of a manner. What you're finding with all of these better systems, so once again, Shimano, Yamaha, Bosch, is that once you kind of get used to how they kick in, it's always going to kick in that way, and it is really intuitive. And that can be the difference between enjoying and making it through a technical section or feeling like you're riding a bike that's a little bit possessed and out of your control. That's going to make a huge difference as to how much you actually enjoy an e-bike. There's a reason that people aren't buying motorbikes for a lot of this stuff, and you're trying to do it in a more intuitive, just pedaling kind of a way when you're doing technical stuff. So having something that responds intuitively and really smoothly, not herky-jerky or on when you don't expect it, these are important features for an e-bike. So keep that in mind, please. I think my biggest issue with e-bikes is the fact that there's so much Chinese random garbage out there. We had someone in just this last week who needed something to do with a battery on their China bike, and they were on a hunt trying to find like a battery specialist that could maybe help them out. But as far as bike shops, we had nothing that we could do to help them. It's going to take a level of electronics repair, not of bike repair, once you get into that sort of stuff. So please stick with the sort of mainstream stuff. It may seem more expensive compared to some of the China bikes, but you are getting yourself more support after the fact and more intuitive, more reliable kind of a bike to ride on the trail. This has been the 2022 Marin Alpine Trail E1, and hope to see you back here for another close-up video review of bikes. Ciao for now.